Good morning. Good Monday morning to you. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. This is what I call my morning musings. We're doing a thematic study of the book of Zechariah, and we've been calling attention to this very, very important term that is found. It really begins starting in chapter 8. But it goes through the end of chapter 14. It is a term, in that day. Now, in that day does not refer to one single 24-hour day. It is a specific period, however, it is the generation in which Jesus lived. It is only a presuppositional theology that would go to these texts and say, oh, well, it didn't happen like I think it should have, therefore it couldn't have happened in the first century. All of these in that day references are to the generation of Jesus, the first century generation. I've already called your attention to chapter 13 and how we find about 3 or 4 of those in that day references. And it has to do with the opening of the fountain of sin, for the cleansing of sin, and for the cleansing of uncleanness. It has to do with the cutting off of the idols out of the land. It has to do with the passing of the prophets, the prophetic office, out of the land. And in that day is the time when the shepherd would be stricken. He would be betrayed in the house of his friend. Now, all of these in that day references belong together. There is no huge temporal gap between in that day when the fountain would be opened and the day of the striking of the shepherd. There just simply is no justification for that in the text. Okay, then we follow those in that day references, and what do we find? It shall come to pass, Zechariah 13 verse 8, that in all of the land, says the Lord, that 2/3 in it shall be cut off and die, 1/3 shall be left in it. I will bring the 1/3 through the fire, will refine them as silver is refined, test them as gold is tested. They will call on my name. I will answer them. I will say, this is my people, and each will say, the Lord is my God. So in the day in which the shepherd would be stricken, in the day in which the shepherd would be betrayed in the house of his friends, in that day 2/3 of Israel would perish. A remnant would be saved. Now, we'll discuss the remnant in our next text, because this has more to do with a physical salvation. Notice it's the remnant that would call on the name of the Lord. They would say, this is our God. And Yahweh would respond, this is my people. But for the moment, notice the absolute irrefutable truth that 3 or 4 times here in Zechariah we are told, in that day, in that day, in that day, and in that day, the day of the opening of the fountain for the cleansing of sin, in that day the prophetic office would cease. In that day Messiah would be betrayed. And in that day 2/3 of the people would be cut off out of the land. Only 1/3 would be saved. You know, we're told that 2/3 of Israel will perish at some future time in the Great Tribulation. Well, this is the Great Tribulation, to be sure. But the in that day references confine it, they delimit it, to use the term, to the first century generation, when the Lord was betrayed, when the fountain for the cleansing of sin was opened. Don't forget, I cover all this in my book, Who is This Babylon? As I demonstrate how the book of Revelation draws on Zechariah so extensively. Get a copy of my book, Who Is This Babylon? Go to my website, www.eschatology.org, www.bibleprophecy.com. Order the book, Who Is This Babylon? Mention that you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, and you don't have to pay shipping. All right? Thanks for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. We'll see you on the flip side.